My name is Lena Carter. I'm 29 years old, and 15 years ago, the people who brought me into this world decided they didn't want me in it anymore. Last week, they showed up at the reading of my guardian's will, smiling, dressed like they'd already won, with a private lawyer beside them. They thought they were about to walk out with millions. They were wrong. And when the attorney reached a certain clause, my mother, who once told me I was no longer her daughter, stood up so fast her chair scraped across the floor. Her face drained of color, and for the first time in my life, she looked afraid. Before I tell you what happened next, if you enjoy stories about justice, family boundaries, and quiet resilience, take a second to like and subscribe, only if this story genuinely speaks to you, and tell me where you're watching from. I read every comment. To understand why my mother reacted that way, you need to go back to the summer of 2009, when I was 13 and convinced I was the problem in my family. I grew up in a small town outside Phoenix. My father, Mark Carter, worked construction, quiet, exhausted, and always agreeing with whatever my mother decided. My mother, Denise, managed a retail store and ran our home with military precision. Then there was my older sister, Ashley. Ashley had my mother's blonde hair, bright eyes, and easy charm. People constantly told my mom how beautiful she was, how she looked just like her. My mother loved hearing that. I didn't look like either of them. I took after my grandmother. Dark hair, darker eyes, quieter personality. My mother never insulted me directly, she just barely noticed me. The difference showed in everything. For Ashley's 16th birthday, my parents rented a hall, hired a DJ, and invited half her school. For my 13th birthday, we sat at the kitchen table with a discounted cake from the grocery store. No name on it, just happy birthday. When I asked why Ashley had a college savings account and I didn't, my mother barely looked up from her phone. She's college material. You'll figure something out. I didn't realize how deep that favoritism went until the summer I got accepted in a national STEM program at Arizona State University. Full scholarship, housing, meals, everything covered. It felt like the first time the world had chosen me. I kept it quiet. I didn't want to get excited out loud. Then Ashley found a drama camp in Los Angeles. 3 weeks, no scholarship, expensive. At dinner, my mother announced her decision like it was obvious. "Lena, you'll decline your science program. We can't afford both, and Ashley's camp will help her future." I stared at my plate, my heart hammered, and before I could stop myself, I said one word: "No." The table went silent. "This is my scholarship," I said, my voice shaking. "I earned it." My mother looked at me like I'd betrayed her. "If you can't put this family first," she said, slowly, "then you're not part of this family." I thought she was angry. I didn't realize she meant it. 3 days later, I came home from the library and found my things packed into trash bags on the porch. My mother stood in the doorway, calm, detached. "I called my brother Daniel," she said. "He'll pick you up. From now on, you're his responsibility." My father didn't speak. My sister watched from upstairs and pulled the curtain closed when our eyes met. I sat on that porch for 4 hours. No porch light, no goodbye. At midnight, my Uncle Daniel arrived. He hugged me without asking questions and said, "You have a home now." That night, as we drove through the desert, I had no idea my parents were signing a document inside that house, one that would resurface 15 years later and change everything. And when it did, it would destroy every plan they walked into that will reading with. But first, I need to tell you how the man they gave me to became the only real parent I ever had, and how that changed the trajectory of my entire life. Uncle Daniel didn't just take me in, he rewrote my future in ways my parents never imagined and unknowingly set the stage for their biggest mistake. Uncle Daniel's house didn't look much from the outside. A single-story home on a quiet street in Tempe, beige walls, a small front yard with a tree that had seen better days. But when he opened the door that night, holding it wide like he'd been waiting for me his whole life, something inside me loosened for the first time. He didn't ask questions right away. He didn't ask what I'd done wrong or why my parents were so angry. He didn't ask me to explain myself. He just pointed down the hallway and said, "That room's yours. We'll figure the rest out tomorrow." The room was small, but it was mine. A real bed, a desk by the window, a door that closed. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to the hum of the air conditioner, trying to understand how everything had fallen apart so quickly, and why, for the first time, I didn't feel scared. The next morning, Uncle Daniel made pancakes. Not the boxed kind, the kind where he cracked eggs into a bowl, messed up the first batch, and laughed at himself while flipping the second. We ate in comfortable silence until he finally said, "You don't owe me anything, but if you want to stay, this is your home." No conditions, no lectures, no guilt, just choice. Uncle Daniel owned a small property management business. Nothing flashy, just a handful of apartment buildings and commercial units he'd built over years of careful work. He left early in the mornings, came home tired, and somehow still found time to ask about my day. At first, I didn't trust it. I was used to love being transactional, earned, revoked. So when he showed up to my school meetings, helped me with science projects, and told my teachers I was brilliant like it was a fact, not a compliment, I kept waiting for the moment it would stop. It didn't. School became my refuge. I stayed late for tutoring, joined clubs, competed in science fairs. For the first time, effort actually led somewhere. Uncle Daniel noticed everything. When I brought home a report card, he didn't just glance at the grades. He sat down and asked what I liked learning. When I mentioned economics in passing, he raised an eyebrow. "That's how the world actually runs," he said. "Numbers tell the truth when people won't." By the time I started high school, he was letting me help with simple tasks at his office, filing paperwork, organizing invoices, learning how leases worked. He never pressured me, he just opened doors and let me walk through them. I graduated high school at the top of my class. When my name was called at the ceremony, I scanned the crowd. Uncle Daniel was there, standing, clapping louder than anyone. No parents beside him, just him. And that was enough. College followed, a business degree, scholarships I applied for myself, long nights, part-time jobs, internships that turned into opportunities because I showed up early and left late. Uncle Daniel never bragged about me, but I once overheard him telling a tenant, "She's the best thing that ever happened to me." I didn't realize how much that sentence meant until years later, because while I was building a life, quietly, steadily, the family I'd left behind was unraveling in ways I didn't see. They didn't call to ask how I was doing. They didn't ask if I was safe. They only reached out when they wanted something. And every time they did, Uncle Daniel protected me from it. Until one day he didn't have to anymore. Because by then, I wasn't the scared 13-year-old on the porch. I was becoming someone they couldn't ignore. And that's when my past started knocking again. But the first knock wasn't about forgiveness. It was about money. The first time my mother reached out wasn't to ask how I was doing. It was to ask for cash, and that call changed how Uncle Daniel saw them forever. For 5 years, my parents didn't contact me at all. No birthday cards, no holidays, no updates passed through relatives. It was as if I'd vanished from their world the moment Uncle Daniel drove me away from that porch. I learned later that my mother told people I'd run off, that I was rebellious, difficult, ungrateful. I didn't correct the story. I was too busy building something that finally felt like mine. The silence broke when I was 18. I was studying for finals in my dorm room when Uncle Daniel called. His voice was tight in a way I hadn't heard before. "They reached out," he said. I knew exactly who he meant. "They asked me for money," he continued. $10,000. Said your father's hours were cut. Mortgage is behind. They didn't ask how you were. Didn't even mention your name. I sat on the edge of my bed, phone pressed to my ear, feeling something hollow open in my chest. "What did you say?" I asked. I said no. There was a pause. "And I told them not to contact you again." That should have been the end of it, but it wasn't. Over the years, they tried different angles. A message passed through a cousin, a vague email that said, "thinking of you," a holiday card with no return address. Nothing that sounded like regret. Everything that sounded like opportunity. My sister sent a wedding invitation when I was 22. No note, no explanation, just my name printed neatly beside Uncle Daniel's address. I didn't go. I didn't respond. At some point, I stopped feeling angry. Anger requires energy. I didn't want to spend mine on people who had already made their choice. After college, I joined Uncle Daniel's company full-time. Not because he offered it, but because I asked. I started at the bottom: admin work, data entry, property walkthroughs in the summer heat, tenants yelling about broken air conditioners like it was my fault. Uncle Daniel never gave me special treatment. He just expected excellence. I worked harder than anyone else because failure felt personal. I learned contracts, budgets, negotiations. I stayed late, took notes, asked questions. When I became operations manager, no one complained. I'd earned it. That's when my name started appearing in local business newsletters. Quiet mentions, small profiles, nothing flashy. But it was enough. Because one day, my mother found me online. She emailed me directly for the first time in over a decade. The subject line read, "Checking in." The message was short, polite, almost warm. She said she'd seen an article about the company's growth, that she was proud of me, that maybe we could catch up sometime. I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I deleted it. Not out of spite, out of clarity. I wasn't the person she was proud of. She was proud of proximity to success, of optics, of what my life could offer her now. I didn't owe her access to the life she'd opted out of. Uncle Daniel never pressured me to respond. He just nodded when I told him and said, "You get to choose peace." For a while, things were quiet again. Until Uncle Daniel got sick. It started with fatigue, then breathlessness, then appointments he didn't tell me about until they piled up. When the diagnosis came, it landed like a weight we both pretended we could carry. Advanced heart failure, limited time. I moved him to specialists, adjusted the business schedule, took on more responsibility without thinking twice. He watched me closely during those months, not with worry, with something like satisfaction. One evening, as we sat on the back porch watching the sun go down, he said, "I need to make sure everything's clear when I'm gone." I told him not to talk like that. He smiled. "I'm not afraid of dying. I'm afraid of loose ends." I didn't know what he meant then. I didn't know he'd already anticipated who would show up after. And I definitely didn't know that the family who abandoned me was already planning their return long before the will reading ever happened. Because when people think they're entitled to something, silence doesn't mean they've forgotten. It means they're waiting.
What I didn't know was that Uncle Daniel had been preparing for their return for years, and what he put in writing would change how the law saw my family forever. The last year of Uncle Daniel's life passed in a strange rhythm. On the surface, everything looked normal. Meetings were held, tenants paid rent, the business expanded slowly but steadily, but underneath it all was an unspoken awareness that time was running out. Uncle Daniel didn't dwell on it. He hated sentimentality. If something needed to be said, he said it simply. If something needed to be done, he did it early. That's how he handled everything, including me. As his health declined, he brought me into conversations he'd once handled alone: estate planning, asset structuring, long-term obligations, not in an emotional way, in a practical one. "People get strange when money's involved," he said once, flipping through a folder at the kitchen table. "Especially family." I didn't ask who he meant. I already knew. One afternoon, I noticed a sealed envelope on his desk with my name written on it. I assumed it was insurance paperwork, or a note I wasn't supposed to read yet. I didn't touch it. That was the kind of trust we had. He made it clear that if anything happened to him, I'd take over operations fully. The staff already knew. Vendors deferred to me first. Banks returned my calls first. Still, I never assumed inheritance. I assumed responsibility. When he passed, it was quiet. No dramatic last words, no hospital chaos, just a phone call in the early morning of the morning, and a stillness that settled into every room of the house. I handled the arrangements. I contacted the attorney he'd worked with for years, organized the memorial, spoke to employees one by one. I didn't notify my biological family. I didn't need to. They found out anyway. The first message came 3 days later, from an unknown number. "I heard about Daniel. I'm so sorry. We should talk." I didn't reply. Then another message, this time from my sister. "We deserve to be there. He was our uncle too." That word, deserved, stood out, because entitlement has a very specific sound when you've heard it all your life. When the attorney scheduled the will reading, she asked me a question I hadn't expected. "Are you prepared for opposition?" I asked her what she meant. She explained that certain relatives had already made inquiries, that a legal representative had requested documents, that someone was preparing to contest. I wasn't surprised. I was just tired. That's when she showed me the file. It wasn't the will. It was older, dated 15 years back. A guardianship transfer, legally notarized, signed by my parents, filed properly. I stared at it like it was written in another language. I remembered that night on the porch, the garbage bags, the waiting. I hadn't known there were signatures involved. I hadn't known my parents had turned a moment of anger into a legal decision. The attorney explained it gently. "From a legal standpoint," she said, "they ceased to be your parents that night." I felt a strange calm settle over me. Not relief, not anger, just understanding. Uncle Daniel hadn't just taken me in, he'd made sure no one could ever take me back or take advantage of me again. Suddenly, his comments over the years made sense. His insistence on documentation, his habit of keeping records. He wasn't paranoid, he was protective, and he knew exactly who would come knocking once he was gone. When my parents formally filed a claim challenging the will, they accused me of manipulation, of isolating him, of taking advantage of a sick man. The irony almost made me laugh. They hadn't spoken to him in over a decade, but they were confident because they didn't know what he'd prepared, and they didn't know that their own signatures would become the strongest evidence against them. The will reading was scheduled for the following Friday. Everyone was invited: charities, auditors, staff, and yes, my parents. They walked in that day expecting money. What they walked into instead was the truth, and the truth was already waiting in writing. By the time my parents arrived at the will reading, every move they planned to make had already been accounted for by the man they underestimated most.
The morning of the will reading, I awoke before my alarm. Not from anxiety, surprisingly, but from clarity. For the first time in years, I wasn't bracing myself for disappointment. I wasn't rehearsing arguments in my head or imagining what I should have said back then. Whatever happened that day wouldn't change who I was anymore. Still, I dressed carefully. A navy blazer, simple jewelry, hair pulled back. Not to impress anyone, just to remind myself that I belonged in every room I entered. The law office occupied the top floors of a downtown high-rise. Glass walls, neutral colors, quiet confidence. The kind of place where emotions were expected to be checked at the door. I arrived early. The attorney, Ms. Reeves, greeted me with a nod. She looked calm, prepared, like someone who knew how this would end. Representatives from charities Uncle Daniel supported filtered in next, then the company auditor, then members of our leadership team. People who had known me as a student, an intern, an executive. People who knew exactly why I was there. At 2 minutes past the hour, the elevator doors opened again. My mother stepped first. She looked composed, dressed in black, pearls at her neck, the kind of outfit meant to signal grief and authority at the same time. My father followed, quieter than I remembered. My sister walked beside him, scanning the room with visible discomfort. And then was their attorney, confident, expensive, and already calculating. My mother's eyes found me immediately. She smiled. It was the same smile she used on customers right before denying a return. Polite, sharp, controlled. "You're here early," she said, as if we were meeting for coffee. I nodded once. "So are you." She tilted her head. "We should talk privately. The reading is about to begin. Now's probably not the best time." Her smile faltered just slightly. The attorney directed them to seating along the wall, not at the table, not central. Observers. That alone irritated her. She whispered something to my sister, who avoided looking at me entirely. As everyone settled, my mother couldn't resist one final attempt to control the room. She introduced herself loudly to a charity representative, mentioned family, mentioned history, mentioned how close they used to be. I kept my gaze forward. I had learned long ago that attention was her oxygen. The attorney began. Formal language, dates, legal confirmations. Then came the inventory, properties, investments, accounts. I didn't look at my parents, but I felt the shift in the room when the numbers were read aloud. This was real now. When the attorney reached the section addressing exclusions, my mother leaned forward. The smile returned. "I make no provision," the attorney read, "for the following individuals for reasons outlined by the deceased and supported by documentation." My mother froze. She didn't expect that sentence. The next words came slowly, deliberately. A debt never repaid. A relationship severed by choice. A legal transfer of guardianship executed voluntarily. My father's breathing changed. My sister whispered something I couldn't hear, and then my mother stood up. "That document is irrelevant," she said sharply. "We're still her family." The attorney didn't raise her voice. "Legally," she said, "you are not." The room went silent. I finally looked at my mother. She was staring at the copy of the document on the table like it had betrayed her. I spoke calmly. "You didn't just ask me to leave. You signed me away." She opened her mouth. Nothing came out. And that's when the attorney turned the page. "That brings us," she said, "to the designation of beneficiary." I felt my heart slow. Not race, slow. Because I already knew this part wasn't about money. It was about finality. And when she read the word that changed everything, the word my parents never expected applied to me, my mother's face lost all color. The attorney didn't rush. She let the silence settle before continuing, as if giving everyone in the room a chance to prepare for what they were about to hear. "I hereby designate," she read,
my legally adopted daughter, Lena Carter, as the sole beneficiary of my estate. Adopted. The word echoed louder than anything else that day. My mother's hand flew to the back of the chair in front of her, like she needed something solid to keep her upright. Adopted? My father whispered. That's not possible. The attorney adjusted her glasses. The adoption was finalized 12 years ago. All documents are filed with the state. My sister looked at my mother, confused. Mom? My mother's lips parted, but no sound came out. She wasn't angry anymore. She was panicked. This is manipulation. She did this. She convinced him. The attorney's response was measured. Mr. Daniel Carter initiated the adoption independently, years after guardianship was established. Medical and legal evaluations confirm he acted of sound mind. The opposing attorney shuffled papers, trying to regain footing. There was no consent from the biological parents. The attorney didn't hesitate. Consent was neither required nor requested. Parental rights were voluntarily relinquished. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. The truth was doing the work for me. My mother finally sat down, her movements stiff, mechanical. She stared straight ahead, like if she didn't move, the moment might rewind itself. But it wouldn't. The attorney continued. The estate, the business, the properties, the home, everything passed to me. Not because I was clever, not because I demanded it, but because someone chose me, legally, deliberately, permanently. My mother stood again, this time slower. This isn't fair, she said, her voice cracked. We're still her family. I looked at her then, really looked. You stopped being that when you made it official. I just didn't know. Her eyes filled with tears, not of regret, but of loss. Loss of control, loss of narrative, loss of access. The attorney concluded the reading. Legal formalities followed. Signatures, a quiet finality. No applause, no celebration. Just truth laid bare. My parents didn't stay long after that. They didn't argue, they didn't threaten. They simply gathered their things and left, smaller than they arrived. As the room cleared, the attorney approached me. He anticipated this, she said softly. Every detail. I nodded. Uncle Daniel had always been like that. Careful, thoughtful, protective. Not just in life, but in death. Outside, the city moved on like nothing had happened. Cars passed, people laughed, coffee shops buzzed. But for me, something fundamental had closed. Not with bitterness, with certainty. That night, I sat alone in the house Uncle Daniel left me. I walked through the rooms slowly. His chair by the window, the desk where he'd worked late nights, the shelf where he kept files labeled in his precise handwriting. On the kitchen counter sat the envelope I'd seen months earlier, the one with my name on it. I opened it. Inside was a single letter, and when I read the first line, I finally cried. The letter Uncle Daniel left behind explained everything and gave me one final lesson I didn't know I still needed.
The letter was handwritten, not typed, not formal. Just Uncle Daniel's familiar, slightly slanted script, the kind that always leaned forward, like he was thinking faster than his pen could move. I sat at the kitchen table and unfolded it carefully, afraid somehow that rushing might undo it. It began simply, "If you're reading this, then I've already done the hardest thing I ever had to do, leave you." My chest tightened. I hadn't realized how much I was still holding in until that moment. He wrote about the day he first met me, how I was small for my age, too polite, too eager to be useful, how I said sorry when I asked for water. "That's when I knew," he wrote, "you didn't need discipline or fixing, you needed safety." He never mentioned my parents by name. He didn't have to. Instead, he wrote about watching me grow, quietly, from the edges of rooms where I never felt fully invited, about noticing how I waited for permission that never came, how I learned to disappear without leaving. "You adapted beautifully," he wrote, "but survival shouldn't be confused with belonging." I paused there for a long time, because that was the sentence I'd been missing my whole life. He explained the adoption without drama, no anger, no blame, just intention. "I didn't adopt you to take something away from anyone," he wrote. "I did it to give you something you were never offered, a permanent place." He knew the truth would hurt. He knew it would shock them, and he knew it would protect me. "They will say it was unfair," he continued, "but fairness has never been the measure of love. Choice is." I folded the letter slightly, then opened it again, reading slower this time. He told me he never expected gratitude, that he didn't want me to prove anything, that the inheritance wasn't a reward. "It's leverage," he wrote, "not so you can win, but so you never have to beg." I smiled through tears at that. That was him, always practical, always thinking 10 steps ahead. At the end of the letter, his handwriting softened, the lines less controlled. "I hope one day you stop asking yourself why they didn't choose you," he wrote, "and start remembering that someone did." When I finished, the house felt impossibly quiet, but not empty. For the first time, I didn't feel like a guest in my own life. In the weeks that followed, my parents tried to reach out. Voicemails, emails, carefully worded messages that spoke more about confusion than accountability. I didn't respond. Not out of spite, but because the chapter was closed. I hired my own attorney, restructured the business, kept what mattered, let go of what didn't. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, I stopped shrinking in rooms. I spoke when I had something to say. I declined invitations without explaining myself. I stopped confusing peace with silence. Sometimes, late at night, I still think about that meeting, about how one word, adopted, ended a lifetime of quiet doubt. Not because it erased the past, but because it reframed it. I wasn't forgotten. I wasn't overlooked. I was protected, just not in the way I expected. And that, I've learned, is how real love often works. Quiet, intentional, unmistakable once you finally see it. Not everyone who raises you chooses you, and not everyone who chooses you ever raises their voice. If this story stayed with you, you're not alone. Like, subscribe, and stay here, where quiet truths finally get heard.